Okay, I think we'll make a start. It's just after 3:30. First of all, a very big welcome to everybody this afternoon. My name is Diana Johnson. I'm the chair of the All-Party Group, Parliamentary Group on Commercial Sexual Exploitation. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this launch of Bust the Business Model. It's a webinar on how to stop sex trafficking and sexual exploitation in the United Kingdom. And today we are launching a new report and website setting out how to bust the business model of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. And I'm delighted to be able to present them to you today, as well as introduce leading international experts who will share their experiences and insights on combating sexual exploitation. And as we are doing this online, I hope everybody will just bear with us if we have any technical problems, because that often happens. And if people could, speakers keep themselves on mute whilst other people are speaking, that would be great. So I'm just going to make some introductory remarks and then we'll move on to our speakers. So today the UK is a high value, low risk destination for sex traffickers. And why is that? And in short, it's because our laws fail to discourage demand for sexual exploitation and allow ruthless individuals to facilitate and profit from it. An inquiry by the predecessor of the APPG on commercial sexual exploitation found that organised sexual exploitation is taking place on an industrial scale in the UK. Organised crime groups are making enormous profits by advertising their victims on pimping websites and moving them around networks of pop-up brothels and hotel rooms to be raped by paying punters. And who are the people these criminal gangs are exploiting? Our inquiry revealed that it is predominantly vulnerable non-UK national women being abused in brothels across Britain. And a significant proportion of them come from one particular country, and that's Romania. For example, over a period of 2 years, Leicestershire Police visited 156 brothels, encountering 421 women, and 86% of whom were from Romania. And Northumbria Police visited 81 brothels over 2 years, and of the 259 women they encountered in the brothels, 75% were Romanian. So who is it that is paying to rape and sexually exploit women in brothels across Britain? So it's sex buyers, the small minority of men in this country who pay for sex. And that's around 3.6% of men in the UK who've paid for sex in the last 5 years, according to the latest figures. But it is their demand that drives sex trafficking, and it is those men who commit the thousands upon thousands of rapes on sex trafficking victims that take place every year in the country. Pimps and traffickers wanting to profit from demand for sexual exploitation currently get a very special helping hand in the UK from pimping websites. These are websites dedicated solely or partly to advertising individuals for prostitution. A few highly lucrative pimping websites dominate the market, centralising and concentrating demand from sex buyers online. And this ready-made, instantly accessible online space to connect with sex buyers substantially lowers the bar of entry into the practice of profiting from sexual exploitation. It makes it quick and easy for traffickers to advertise their victims to sex buyers, and right now these pimping websites are completely legal. So to stop sexual exploitation, we have to bust this business model of this horrific trade. And how do we do that? Well, we've been very clear in the APPG. It means deterring sex buyers by making it a criminal offence to provide payment or other benefit in exchange for sex acts, stopping pimping websites and other third-party exploiters fueling sexual exploitation by making it an offence to enable or profit from the prostitution of another person, and crucially, supporting victims by repealing criminal sanctions for soliciting and providing a comprehensive resourced network of support and exiting services. And as we will hear, and a number of us already know, Sweden was the first country to adopt this demand reduction approach when it introduced the Sex Purchase Act in 1999, affording over 2 decades of evidence of its effectiveness. Research on the impact of the Sex Purchase Act reveals that demand has dropped, public attitudes have transformed, and traffickers are being deterred. An official evaluation of Sweden's Sex Purchase Act stated, according to the Swedish police, it is clear that the ban on the purchase of sexual services acts as a barrier to human traffickers and procurers who are considering establishing themselves in Sweden. The effectiveness of this approach is why countries including France, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Israel, Iceland and Norway have all followed Sweden's lead and introduced demand reduction legislation. And the absolute necessity of reducing demand in order to combat sexual exploitation is why the UK has multiple international legal obligations to do so. Demand reduction legislation is designed to end the enormous profits currently enjoyed by traffickers, pimping websites and brothel operators in the UK, as well as remove the legal impunity currently enjoyed by men who pay for sex. Unsurprisingly, there are some who do not want to reduce demand for sexual exploitation, and myths and misinformation have been spread to discourage policymakers from taking action. So our report, Bust the Business Model, tackles these myths. It makes clear that sexual abuse is never a solution to poverty, but our continued tolerance of this harmful trade puts vulnerable women and girls at risk from traffickers and pimps who seek to profit from it, and that suggestions criminalising paying for sex will only serve to drive sexual exploitation underground fundamentally misunderstands the nature of this trade. Sex buyers need to locate women to sexually exploit, and if sex buyers can find the women, then so can the police and support services. Exchanging money, accommodation, goods or services in return for sex acts is sexual exploitation and abuse. It is a form of violence against women, and right now, however, sex buyers can abuse with impunity, and pimping websites owners are free to get rich from it. So it's time for the British Parliament to act, and we must bust the business model of sexual exploitation. So the report that I'm referring to, you can download from the Bust the Business Model website, which is bustthebusinessmodel.org, as well as we'd ask people to email their MP and ask them to take action. So having set the scene, I'm really delighted now to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, who is Diane Martin CBE. And Diane, having survived prostitution in her late teens, has spent nearly 2 decades supporting women to exit prostitution, with 15 years as the founder and director of a specialist service for women involved in or exiting from street prostitution. In 2013, Diane was awarded a CBE for services to vulnerable women in prostitution, and earlier this year she became an inaugural member of the International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Board, launched by the OSCE, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. So I'm really delighted that Diane's joined us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Dame Diana. It's great to be joining you here today at the launch of this important report and corresponding website. I'm honoured to have been invited to speak alongside the expertise of today's panel, and I'd like to thank Dame Diana, the APPG and UK Feminista for their commitment to addressing these important issues. In my late teens, I was exploited through prostitution in London, and then trafficked to a prostitution ring in the Middle East. Over the past 25 years, I've had the great privilege of helping hundreds of women exit prostitution and rebuild their lives. During those years, I never met one woman who didn't want to get out. Prostitution is inherently harmful and you cannot make it safe. My own experience in what was ridiculously termed high-class prostitution, run by an agency that was referred to as the safest in London. And I can tell you that there's nothing high-class about getting raped or having bite marks on my face or being asked at gunpoint if my mum knew where I was and if I'd like to see her again. The location of the surroundings do not reduce the impact of what is experienced, and we must dismiss the false narrative around women and girls choosing prostitution. Prostitution chooses women and girls, and demand creates prostitution and trafficking. As we've heard, sexual exploitation and sex trafficking in the UK is at epidemic proportions, and profiteers, pimps, and organised crime groups also use adult websites to create a mainstream market to sell women for sex. It's huge business, and these websites incentivize that and make it easy. They encourage violence against women by doing so, and for wider society, they perpetuate harmful stereotypes and gender equality. We must seek to actively eradicate commercial sexual exploitation, holding perpetrators to account and providing sustainable exit routes for the women and girls whose vulnerabilities are exploited as they are funneled into the dehumanising system of prostitution. I want the UK to adopt the Nordic model, legislation which completely decriminalises those selling sex and provides that exiting support, and where sex buyers, pimps, traffickers and third-party facilitators who create the demand are criminalised. Traffickers and pimps are willing to take the risks because of the sizable profits, but they also want to reduce risks where they can so that their crimes can carry on uninterrupted. Evidence shows that they will favour operating in countries where the demand is not tackled by the criminal justice system. Currently, the UK is good for organised crime. Full decriminalisation means the whole of the sex industry is decriminalised, so pimps and sex buyers are legitimised as managers and clients and present what is exploitation as work, even framing it around human rights. I can't think of a job where you need a detailed exit plan to leave, or where daily you risk physical, emotional and sexual violence. Also, when you're legally recognised as a worker, you also then have legal obligations. In systems where prostitution is legalised or fully decriminalised, you could be criminally sanctioned through fines for not meeting these obligations. It's only the Nordic model framework where women are completely decriminalised. Those describing themselves as independent, empowered sex workers who have chosen this supposed work constitute a minuscule minority of those in the sex trade. We know that the vast majority of women in the UK sex trade are not UK nationals. The reality of prostitution is that there are nearly always underlying issues that create the conditions of that vulnerability. Most women and girls' routes into prostitution have been paved with these underlying issues that contribute to a pathway of vulnerability that includes a lack of choice, poverty, displacement by wars, childhood sexual abuse, neglect, addiction, or coercive and controlling relationships. That's why we must rid ourselves of this false dichotomy we're continually presented with, that of course sex trafficking is bad, but prostitution is a choice and a job. Both rely on gender inequality and vulnerability. Both are inherently harmful, trapping girls and women in a violent and predatory system. Both are fueled by demand, and often it's the same men paying. When I think of my own experiences, I never separated out my experience in prostitution in London and my experience of being trafficked overseas, because my body and my psyche did not experience those things in different ways. The more demand you have in a country, the bigger the sex industry, and the bigger the sex industry, the larger the scale of sex trafficking. As we've heard, we've got 20 years of evidence now from Sweden where the demand is very low. The Swedish police and Interpol agree that Sweden is almost a dead market for trafficking, for sexual exploitation because of that low demand. Since Sweden brought these laws in 1999, there has not been one murder of a woman related to prostitution. Germany's figures are in sharp contrast. Between 2000 and 2017, there have been 86 murders and 35 attempted murders documented. That's only the ones that we know about. And year on year, the percentages of foreign women continue to go up and up. Of those murdered or attempted murder victims from 2010 to 18, now 60.7% are foreign women, with the most common countries of origin being Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Ukraine, and Poland, and that tells us a lot. In the mega brothels of Germany, it's legal and seen as a job. In each room, there's a panic button. There have been 13 known murders or attempted murders in those legal, government-sanctioned premises where you would be hard-pressed to find any German nationals. It is beyond my comprehension when organisations or individuals can have it right and understand the oppression and exploitation that women as a class are vulnerable to on issues such as female genital mutilation, domestic violence, and even on sex trafficking. But when it comes to prostitution, it's suddenly only about work and labour rights. Do we apply this to children in poverty? No, of course not. There is a trade in human organ trafficking. Should we support a commercial trade in organs? No. Neither should we then just have this acceptable category of exploitation for women in poverty. And if it is a job like any other, then it's certainly not one that alleviates poverty, but more often than not, it traps women there, often in debt or under control. Opponents will say it will drive things underground. It won't. As has been pointed out, by its very nature, prostitution needs a way to supply the demand to the sex buyer. They'll say it'll clear out all the good sex buyers and leave the dangerous ones. It won't. And the myth of the good punter is just that, a myth. Steve White, as we knew here in the UK in Ipswich, was a regular known by many of the women. It did not stop him murdering 5 of them. Here are 2 quotes from regular German sex buyers compiled by Manu Schoen, a German sociologist at the height of COVID-19 last year, that highlight attitudes towards already exploited women. Sex buyer 8, clubs and brothels will not be reopened anytime soon. We were afraid of the Nordic model, now we get the COVID model, 0 prostitution. Sex buyer 6, at the moment they are all scared. Usually here in the Bremen area, you need to pay €200 when ordering someone to your place. I only paid €130. The whores need money, so they make it for less money to have customers at all. Opponents say, you won't be able to vet sex buyers. They can't vet them now. You cannot tell who's going to be violent or kill you, and many women have no say in who the sex buyer is. Once you're in that car or behind that closed door, you're extremely vulnerable to violence and sexual exploitation. Women and girls have a human right to live a life free from violence and exploitation, and for us in the UK to be a progressive nation where our girls and boys grow up in a society where we have genuine equality. It is gender inequality that make women and girls vulnerable to sexual exploitation in the first place, and we will never have equality while men are able to pay for the use of women's bodies delivered behind the closed door, whether it's the door of a car or the door of a 5-star hotel. I have listened for over 25 years to women who have experienced being behind that closed door. I was behind that closed door, the door of 5-star hotels, the door of palaces, the door of diplomats' embassies. What's behind that door is entitled men who believe that paying affords them permission to do anything, to rape, to threaten, to instill fear. On many occasions, I wondered if and in what state I would be exiting from that door. We need a vision for the UK, a long-term vision that becomes a reality we can be proud of, a reality that rejects women being for sale with the inherent harm that results, a reality that addresses the demand by criminalising pimps, traffickers, website facilitators and sex buyers. This is far from a cost-free business, and that cost is being paid for by the abuse and exploitation of women, where they exist as objects, treated like a commodity, consumed and discarded. Our government needs to draw a firm line and robustly act on these realities in a way that means something tangible, where women and girls are provided with resourced and realistic options in order to get out of the sex trade and truly build the lives they would choose for themselves. In conclusion, The meetings and discussions we're having are not just an intellectual exercise. As we speak here today, that exploitation is happening right now to real people, a living hell in most cases. We need brave MPs and legislators who will not stand by in the face of the realities of prostitution and trafficking and do nothing about it. We cannot let them down. We need to do everything in our power to shut down the sex trade and the harm it inflicts, and we need to do it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. I've heard you speak a couple of times, and I just think it's so powerful what you have to say. So thank you for speaking to us this afternoon. We're now going to hear from our second speaker. This is Tsitsi Matekaire. Tsitsi is the global lead for ending sex trafficking at Equality Now. She joined Equality Now in 2016 and provides strategic leadership on the organisation's global programme to end sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. She has over 16 years of experience of advocating for women's rights in Africa and the UK. And before joining Equality Now, she was programme manager at Womankind worldwide. She's also worked with women's rights organisations in Zimbabwe as the director of the Women in Politics Support Unit and as a legal officer at the Women's Action Group. So you're very welcome. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by congratulating Diana and the All-Party Parliamentary Group for hosting this event and for the launch of your new report. As Equality Now, we are really encouraged that sex trafficking and sexual exploitation are being highlighted as important priorities that need addressing in England and Wales. And we know and hope that this will also raise momentum across the whole of the UK for urgent action on these issues. There is no shortage of ways that people end up in the sex trade, but the constant factor throughout is that it is gendered. Sex and gender-based inequality is at the heart and crux of it. From the global statistics, we know that the majority of trafficked persons are women and girls, and the majority of them are trafficked for sexual exploitation, mainly in prostitution. We also know that sex trafficking is the most common form of human trafficking, and it is also the most lucrative, and globally makes over $99 billion in profit for traffickers and pimps. In addition to gender and sex-based inequality, there are also intersecting inequalities that worsen the situation for women and girls. Women exploited in the sex trade are more likely to have experienced discrimination on the basis of poverty, homelessness, or have been affected by failures in the care system, child sexual abuse, or people that have insecure migrant status, or have experienced racial or ethnic discrimination, or discrimination on the basis of their gender or sex identity. And this is the same in the UK as in other places across the world. We have also seen presently in the context of COVID, how the pandemic has exposed and worsened inequalities and has placed already vulnerable people at even greater risk of sexual exploitation. Often when we think about sexual exploitation and trafficking, and prostitution in particular, we default to thinking just about individual people. Often our first thoughts don't see the industry, an industry that includes many actors who are fueling, sustaining, and benefiting from buying and selling of women and girls' bodies. We may not immediately think of the pimps or traffickers, brothel keepers, or those that are operating websites where vulnerable people are being advertised and sold and bought. And these are the people who run the sex trade and are making huge profits in the process. And we should also think about those who buy sex, because without their money, there would be no industry to speak of. It's important that our analysis of the commercial sex trade also looks at all these systems and conditions that lead to sex trafficking, prostitution, and other forms of sexual exploitation, and that keep exploited people trapped in the system. By so doing, we can come to the conclusion that the sex trade does not just exist because they are vulnerable people. It happens also because there are people who are willing to pay access to women's bodies, and it is with their money that the industry is perpetuated and sustained. They have a sense of entitlement over women's bodies and are willing to abuse their positions of power to take advantage of vulnerability of other people, and are deriving personal sexual gratification from the process. And all of this is occurring within a society that does not treat everyone as equal, and especially does not treat women and girls as equal. The sex trade is therefore a biased market, especially where additional external factors such as global pandemics are exacerbating women's vulnerabilities. And taking all of this into account, we can also come to the conclusion that sexual exploitation in its many forms is a function of sex and gender inequality and abuse of male power and privilege, and therefore it is gender-based violence. The CEDAW committee, in its new general recommendation on trafficking, reinforces the understanding that trafficking and sexual exploitation of women and girls is unequivocally a phenomenon that is rooted in structural sex-based discrimination, and that it constitutes gender-based violence. And as we know, the UK is a signatory to the CEDAW Convention. Gender-based violence cannot be overcome or navigated at an individual level. It really requires a holistic and whole society approach. And in the context of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, we need to ensure that our laws and policies enshrine the following. They should be aspects of prevention, and we can do this by ensuring that our laws and policies address the gender and systemic inequalities that lead to vulnerabilities. Our laws and policies must also ensure protection and ensuring that those who are exploited are not criminalized, but rather supported, included being provided with exit services. And our laws and policies must also look at accountability and address impunity by making it a criminal offense to buy sex. Buying sex is exploitation, and without the buyer's demand, the sex trade would not exist and thrive. So in order to achieve gender equality and to put an end to sexual exploitation, it is essentially critical that we address the issue of demand. We also need to ensure accountability through the law beyond traffickers, other exploiters that are benefiting and profiteering from the sex trade. So we're talking of pimps, brothel keepers, and in today's digital age, the law should also make tech platforms and these websites where women are being advertised accountable for enabling sexual exploitation to occur. So this is the equality model with all those different aspects, which acknowledges that sexual exploitation is grounded in sex and gender-based inequality and discrimination, and points to the need for any government to adopt a holistic and joined up approach to ensure that we address these issues for women and girls in all spheres of life, from birth and throughout the life cycle, as a way of reducing as well their vulnerability to exploitation. The equality model is also challenging male entitlement to women's bodies and their so-called right to buy sex, and prevent, and it also helps to prevent the continuum of violence against women. It is also about sending a very strong message to society that coercing and purchasing sexual access to women's bodies is not acceptable, and that our government is committed to supporting victims of gender-based violence, and that our society should become a much more gender equal society. And as we have heard before, this legislative model has been adopted in other countries, Sweden, Northern Ireland, France, Canada, and so on. And there have been tremendous results since the adoption of the law, of their laws. And in conclusion, we know from the government policies that the UK government has already made the commitment to address gender-based violence and violence against women, and has acknowledged that it is unacceptable in our society. So the government must be bold in its approach to tackling gender inequality and gender-based violence. And as such, it follows that the UK must adopt the equality model. It's an approach that must be adopted across all the 4 nations. And we've seen Northern Ireland has already paved the way. And we hope that we can galvanize sufficient political will to make this a reality in England and Wales and Scotland as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I think setting it in that context of the sex and gender inequality and discrimination is really important, that we really remember that. So thank you for that. We're now going to move on to our third speaker, Mia de Fuichere. I hope I've said that right.
Yes, fine. Yeah.
Good. And Mia is a survivor and activist, and she spent 6 years in prostitution. She was a core partner in the successful Turn Off the Red Light campaign, which resulted in the adoption of demand reduction legislation in Ireland. And since exiting prostitution, Mia has obtained a BA Hons in philosophy and sociology and a master's in law at Maynooth University. So Mia, we're very pleased to hear from you this afternoon.
Thanks, and I'm delighted to be here, and many thanks, Diana and UK Feminister, for organising this important event. So, like you said, I have 6 years experience in the sex trade, exiting in 2010. But I'll just briefly, I entered the sex trade because I had developed a heroin problem. And at the time, it seemed like a rational decision. It would pay for it until I got sorted. But I had no idea of the world I was about to step into. And once you step into prostitution, within a very short space of time, your only human contact becomes either the other addicted or damaged women standing beside you, or the men who purchase you. So your view of the world becomes very different. And of course, the messages are sent in from society. Eggs are thrown at, insults. Like being a prostitute, it's like the worst insult a woman can call a woman. So when you're actually living as that, it's very hard to see a way back, and you become trapped. And then, of course, the inevitable happens, violence. My first experience with violence was extreme. It was a gang rape, and my friend did not survive. She died alone a few weeks later. But I had 3 further rapes and countless physical assaults, humiliations. It's just horrendous. And this fear and the threat of violence, it hovers around you all the time. So to me, that level of violence in 6 years, 1 gang rape, 3 rapes, and all of the other things, there isn't another industry that would tolerate that level of violence. There isn't anything. It would be shut down. But you can't. It can never be made safe. You can never end the violence, no matter what the legislation, because it is up to the person that bought you. So it's you and him on your own. And it is up to him and only him as to how things will play out. So unless like a bodyguard is going to be given, like it's impossible. And also, like Diane mentioned Steve Wright, and he was known to the women and he was irregular, and there's this misconception that the ones that rape or will be really violent have a sign on their head, or we can identify them. But there's a principle in prostitution that so because you have been bought, okay, and they've paid money for you, and they paid maybe good money for you to do something or to do something to you, and if that isn't working out for them, or they're not satisfied or something, you know, it's like when you buy something and you take it home and it doesn't work properly. One of the first things you'll do, you know, is bang it or you'll shake it. The same principle applies in prostitution because you have become a commodity. So very often, buyers who have initially had not intended to be violent very often end up being so because of that principle. So I just wanted, because that's quite hard to explain. Also, there's this idea that we can choose buyers, or you know, if you get a sense that they're dangerous or whatever, and you can refuse them. And yes, that is possible. And I had found myself at times there where I came across someone and they were, you know, I just thought what they asked was absurd, and I felt stronger that evening and I said, no, I'm not doing that. And yes, they walked away. So, but, you know, I may have felt a sense of empowerment or whatever, but they didn't go home and say, right, well, I'm not doing that, she's right, it's awful, whatever. No, they didn't. They just go and find a more vulnerable woman. So my brief sense of empowerment as more than likely came at the expense of somebody else, so I can't claim a victory. Now, when I exited prostitution in 2010, also for the last 18 months of my time, I stood alongside a trafficked woman, although we wouldn't have used that terms. I wouldn't have fully understood, but she had no control of her life. She'd been trafficked 12 years under his control. Her life was so inhumane, and it was just horrendous. People like to separate us. We stood on the same street. We were bought on 2 occasions together, and we were bought by the same buyers on different nights. We can never be separated because it isn't geography or the logistics of how we got there that connects us. What connects us is that we are bought and used and exploited and often raped by the same group of people, buyers. And I'm afraid no one can break that connection. It can't be broken at any time in any country by anyone. You know, so unless you do something to address the cause, which is the demand, which is the buyers, then the traffic will not only continue, it'll grow. So I just wanted to make that point. In Ireland, I exited in 2010 with the help of a social worker, and it took me a couple of years to get my senses, as Diane and Tsitsi said, that it's hard to reintegrate back to life and takes a lot of support and services. But I joined the Turn Off the Red Light because I couldn't justify anything I had witnessed, and you know, I just couldn't. So we campaigned. It took a few years. It was contentious. It was part 4 of the largest overhaul of criminal law in Ireland, the Sexual Offences Act 2017. So it was part 4. But although it was contentious, it was the essence of the act. And by that I mean, as long as women, you know, it formally removed the female body from the market. Okay, women are no longer for sale. Bodies can no longer be a commodity, and that changes things in gender equality perspective. For me, it's the biggest step in gender equality, because prostitution, commercial sexual exploitation, is the cruelest form of gender inequality. So in 2017, we managed successful. We were successful in the campaign, and it was adopted. Now it is only 3 years old, so it's in its infancy. So I will just there was an interim report released just before Christmas. The review of the law will be out later this year, but so far the results are positive. In regards the connection between, I cannot emphasize how much and how important the police are in their role in this, and I have been fortunate and honoured to have spent the last 12 months, 18 months now, working with over 400 British police officers with training. So our police, the positive impact so far. There's an increased willingness for women to report crimes, and all crimes against prostituted women are taken seriously here now by the police. The women in indoor prostitution, we have welfare checks now, and they're taken as priority. There's a much better relationship between the police and the women. Now I had to work very hard on that, because a lot of the women here are Eastern European, so trusting the police isn't their first. You know, it doesn't come automatically. So there has been no, there is, you may hear that people, violence has increased here. The violence in prostitution, there's no evidence that it's increased, but what has increased is the reporting of the violence. So of course, there may seem like, you know, but if this law was here when I was in prostitution, okay, I have about 17 cautions for soliciting. I have was brought to court once. If the law had been there, you see, when you're viewed as a criminal and you're surviving in this criminal world, you tend to keep your mouth shut. You know, you don't tend to tell. So I get frustrated now, because if the law had been there, there is so much stuff I could have shared with the police, because I actually did have a good relationship, but their hands were tied. So that relationship and that trust, you know, brings support and intelligence, of course. Now, people have been saying that Ireland kept the brothel keeping law. It's a much necessary law, but it hasn't increased. So, for example, in 2010, there were 65 reported incidents, and this is the actual Garda statistics, 65 in 2010. There was only 13 in 2019. Soliciting offences, 2010 there was 116, and 2019 there was only 8. So they are the official figures, no matter what else others. Look, there are people who do not like this law. There are people with serious vested interest in the sex trade. It is now worth 180 million estimated in Ireland. So they're going to make noise about that. But please, there are official statistics there. And I wanted to leave a quote with the police. And this is from the Garda National Bureau, Special Bureau, where the prostitution unit is. We have shifted our gaze away from women towards where, even when it is not vulnerability, towards the demand. This law is about reducing prostitution and making it a very unattractive for people, so that it's not a worthwhile business for organised traffickers. We want to make Ireland a very unattractive place for organised prostitution. Chasing the money is absolute key. The one thing that these crime gangs and organisers are very precious about is their money. And every single penny they make comes from a sex buyer. That connection has to be, you know. So in finish, you know, I hope you are our nearest neighbour. Ireland has now closed the door on traffickers. It's in its infancy. We have a lot of work to do yet. France has, the Scandinavians have. So you're now in a prime position to be, if you leave it as a free flow for traffickers and this exploitation. So you need to act. And also for society in general, you know, that women, that male, because there's a lot of talk about consent these days, but you can give as many lessons on consent as you like. But as long as a man is able to go online and pick a woman or drive down a street and purchase her, the confusion remains. And that filters through to our homes and our workplaces and our schools. This law, a sex buyer law, ends that confusion. And I hope the United Kingdom follow Ireland and France and Sweden and everybody. You know, that is my wish. And thanks.
Thank you very much, Mia. That was excellent. And I think it gives us hope that you were able to see that change in the law in Ireland. And you're absolutely right. We are your nearest neighbours, and Northern Ireland has obviously taken some action, and it looks like Scotland may do so too. So it does mean that England and Wales, we need to get our act together on this. So thank you for that. Our final speaker is Valiant Richie. And he is the senior representative at the OSCE. That's, for everyone so they know, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And his role is as the coordinator for combating trafficking in human beings. And he represents the OSCE at the political level on anti-trafficking issues and assists the 57 OSCE participating states in the development and implementation of anti-trafficking strategies and initiatives. And before joining the OSCE, Val worked for 13 years as a prosecutor in the United States, including handling sexual assault, child exploitation and human trafficking cases. So you're very welcome. We look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks very much, Dame Diana, and thanks to the APPG for the invitation to participate in the launch of this really important paper. I'm humbled to be part of this event and to follow Diane and Mia's incredible words, really powerful. But let me say congratulations to the APPG for this important report and also for raising this incredibly important topic. In my view, working with the 57 OSCE countries, the most significant piece of the global anti-trafficking strategy that is missing is attention to demand. It's just that simple. As an international community, we're putting substantial resources into prosecution, into protection of victims, and yet we're currently losing the battle in pretty significant ways. Estimates about the amount of money generated from this industry have tripled in recent years. The number of child victims of trafficking tripled in the last 15 years. These are just some of the data points showing that we're not getting a grip on the problem. And even though the number of identified victims continues to go up, prosecutions are actually declining. And so in the words of a survivor, Rachel Moran from Ireland, how do you expect to uproot a tree if all you're doing is ripping at the leaves? The fact of the matter is that it's time to address the core problem here, which is demand. So why do we need to address demand? I think the paper sets out the reasons really well, and I just want to emphasize a few of them. The first one, in my view, is because the current model is not working. The approach of not addressing demand is failing. And it's time to turn the tables and start addressing the core cause. The reason for that is that we need to undermine the financial motivations behind trafficking. Traffickers don't do what they want because it's fun. They do what they want because they like to make a lot of money. And if we can undermine those financial motivations by curbing demand, we can try to get a grip on the problem. The second or more important reason, though, is about reducing harm. The incentive to traffic, to forcibly coerce people into exploitation comes from the desire to make money from demand. And if we can discourage that, we can reduce that harm to trafficked victims. But we also don't want to forget about the harm that users cause directly to victims as a result of being in direct and intimate contact with victims, as Diane and Mia just described. This is a harm that is often glossed over, and the harm of trafficking is always identified as that caused by the trafficker, but not by the user. When in fact, those rapes that were so just heartbreakingly discussed earlier, that's the harm that causes that trauma that lasts a lifetime. As Mia said, you can't separate that trauma based on somebody who was in prostitution versus somebody who was being trafficked. I think also the point about gender and racial equality cannot be overstated. Trafficking for sexual exploitation vastly disproportionately impacts women and girls, in particular, women and girls who are minorities. How do we expect to achieve gender equality with all the work that's going on that topic right now, and yet maintain unfettered demand? It's not possible. They are in direct conflict with each other. And so to do one, we have to do the other. It's time to address that issue of male sexual violence against women. And in this regard, I just want to note, I looked at the participant list. There's a tremendous amount of women on this, not very many men. Men who are not buyers need to start stepping up a little bit and bringing their voices to this issue, because it can't only be women raising this topic. Men need to say that this is completely unacceptable from our perspective as well. So it's important to address demand. Now, how are countries doing? Not good. We are currently conducting a study on countries complying with their international legal obligations, and over 20 of the OSCE 57 countries are doing no identifiable law or prevention effort at all on demand. And we question why trafficking is out of control. For those that are doing something, implementation is certainly lacking. Let me give you a good example. The UK actually has a pretty decent law, 53A of the Sexual Offences Act, that allows you to prosecute somebody who uses a trafficking victim. In 10 years, 2010 to 2019, there were 66 convictions. In 2019 alone, there was over 1,600 identified trafficking victims. 66 convictions in a decade. That is totally inadequate to get a grip on the problem. And that's one of the reasons that a much more robust response is needed. When some countries pass a law on demand and everybody says, see, it didn't solve the problem. Well, of course it didn't solve the problem if you only convicted 66 people in a decade. That's not implementation. So what are my recommendations for the way forward? I think first and foremost, the paper outlines what needs to be done, which is a more robust criminal justice response. And this includes both recognizing those who are using trafficking victims, but also recognizing the broader problem of demand, because you can't really distinguish those two. And international law recognizes this. The Palermo Protocol doesn't talk about demand for trafficking. There is no such thing as your paper recognizes. It's the demand that fosters exploitation that leads to trafficking. This is a much more broad concept, and that's the concept that should be used in policymaking. That all buying needs to be addressed if you're going to try to address the buying that is incentivizing trafficking. One of the values of a criminal law, and there are those who oppose the criminalization, but let me talk about why I think it's important. It holds demand accountable for the harm that it's causing by incentivizing trafficking, but also the direct harm to victims. Recognizing that harm and holding those responsible accountable for that harm is a crucial piece of this response. It also incentivizes law enforcement to pay attention to the problem. In countries where there are no criminalization aspects of demand, law enforcement is not incentivized to work on this issue. But if there are criminal sanctions available, then law enforcement will pay attention and more closely scrutinize. And the last reason is it sets a norm. We need a norm against this conduct because it's incentivizing trafficking and driving it. There needs to be some statement against it. If you don't have a law saying that, it sort of implies that it's okay. And that's the current situation, I think, in the United Kingdom. The last 2 points I want to make, though, because I know we're low on time, are these. A criminal law is not going to solve this problem on its own. It's a fundamental piece of the response, but there has to be a broader attempt at developing a prevention framework. Criminalization and criminal prosecution should really be the last point in the interaction in trying to address this problem. We need to start talking way upstream about educating young men and boys and adolescents about healthy relationships, mutuality, respect, consent, gender equality, all of these concepts. We need to start talking about addressing this issue of demand from a public health lens, which is certainly something where government can be involved, in terms of understanding how it fosters harm to people who are vulnerable and how it is not conducive to gender equality. We need to be using all sorts of technology-based interventions to try to deter and discourage demand before we even get to the point where transactions and harmful rapes are happening. Again, criminalization is certainly an important piece of the pie, but I want to really encourage a more comprehensive perspective on this that can do more at preventing in the long term. And the final piece is websites that have been mentioned several times. These websites are out of control. The Scottish Parliament paper on this was very insightful in understanding that, and they need to be addressed. These are platforms for exploitation that encourage and facilitate and foster demand. And if those are not addressed, the demand intervention techniques that are being discussed here today will have a very hard time being successful. So those three aspects of criminalization, prevention, and addressing demand, I think, or excuse me, addressing websites are the three pieces of the puzzle that should be considered as the way forward. Finally, victims need support, not sanction. I love that phrase from the paper, and I think it could not be more clear. It's not going to help the process if we keep punishing them. They need enough support and help to recover anyway, and criminalization is not going to help them at all. We're going to be releasing a paper on our findings, and I hope that paper is useful to Parliament moving forward on this. And on June 14th to the 16th, our annual Alliance Conference for all the 57 countries of the OSCE will be talking about this issue of demand, and we hope you can all attend and help us raise attention to this important issue. Thank you so much, Dame Diana, for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. I really appreciate it, and thanks to all my fellow panelists who gave such powerful words today. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. And that I think was a really excellent way of rounding off our speakers today with your 3 points. I think that was really very helpful, and I think we'll look with interest what your report says, and hopefully we'll keep the dialogue going as to what more we can do. Can I just say a huge thank you to everybody who's spoken today. I think they've all been remarkable in their own way, but I think we'll lead members of Parliament and the staff in members of Parliament's offices to really look at this again and to see what more we can do, redouble our efforts in Parliament. There's certainly some legislation kicking around in the UK Parliament that we may want to look at amending. There's certainly an online harms bill coming up where we might want to see what we can do about the pimping websites in particular. And you'll know, many of you, that we have a police bill going through Parliament at the moment, and there's some opportunities there because it's what we call a Christmas tree. It's got lots of things in it, so it does open up the potential to put forward amendments around some of the things we've been discussing today and looking at what's worked in other countries. So thank you once again. And can I also particularly thank UK Feminista for organising this, and Kat Banyard for all her brilliant help and assistance. And I'm sure we will keep talking, and we will hopefully start to see some movement in England and Wales as well. So thank you again, everyone who's participated today. It's been really excellent. Thank you. Thank you.